first part of my presentation is my personal narrative as a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was born in 1948 to two parents who had both experienced profound trauma, including abandonment in their early childhoods. I now, of course, understand, as a result of their deprived childhoods, I experienced a high level of emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, resulting in, as Mercurio Cecchini refers to in his book, as unmet needs of affection and nurturance. So I do recall seeking out people to have these unmet needs met. Example, school teachers and neighbours, etc. Apparently, at 7.5 years of age, I experienced an episode of child sexual abuse from our next door neighbour, a father of two girls, the same age as my younger sister and myself. This experience was apparently so horrific for me, I experienced dissociative amnesia for most of the memory of what actually happened that day. I became mute and required speech therapy for 6 months to be able to resume communicating. This dissociative amnesia has continued for decades. However, over the past 7 years, I have come to understand this phenomenon, and with insight and awareness, I can now engage in a number of coping strategies to better manage this. My mother for decades always painted an extremely black picture of myself to family and friends. Our relationship was extremely difficult at times, and it was always my fault and my problem. I was a drama queen. I was very much a black sheep in our family. She never seemed or appeared to be able to make the possible connection between the effects of my child sexual abuse and the impact on my lived experiences with her and my family. So after many, many decades, I have come to understand that what I have been experiencing throughout my life are some of the core clinical symptoms of child sexual abuse: impaired affect regulation, disassociation, fragmented memory, denial of needs, difficulties around trust and power and control, shattered and fragmented self, disintegration, anxiety, shame and guilt, and compromised sexuality. In mid-2009, at 61 years of age, 54 years after my child sexual abuse, aspects of my child sexual abuse were disclosed by my mother to both my sister and my father, but not to me. So I then approached my mother to determine what had actually happened from her perspective. And she said, "Oh, I can't remember. It is so long ago." It is interesting to reflect that my mother, in point of fact, had an excellent but selective memory. However, when I needed validation, support, and understanding from her for the way I had been and was at times throughout my life as a result of the sexual abuse, she denied me these critical, long overdue understandings to be met for me. My mother died 6 months later without ever disclosing to me any of the details of my child sexual abuse. My greatest sadness is never having had a truly meaningful mother-daughter relationship between us, and also her lack of insight and understanding into the reasons why this was so. I have always struggled with her overall denial, as my mother, for decades, that anything at all had in fact happened to her eldest child, Yvette, as a young, helpless, vulnerable 7.5-year-old child. The second part of my presentation is our son Doug's narrative as a non-survivor of child sexual abuse. Our first child, Douglas, was born in 1969, so I was a new mother who was carrying the undiagnosed intergenerational trauma of emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, combined with the repressed memory of child sexual abuse and with the unmet needs of affection and nurturance previously mentioned. Graham, my husband, had undiagnosed PTSD from his naval service in 1964 as a result of the Melbourne Voyager collision, the worst naval peacetime disaster in Australia's history. In my opinion now, there was no doubt then that we both had an impaired and somewhat inadequate capacity to parent adequately, similar to my parents' impaired capacity. Graham, my husband, a policeman, had been mentored as a child by a man down the road who was wonderful and who taught him everything he knew about fishing. That was such a positive experience for him. So when our next door neighbour, who was a handyman, invited Douglas to join him, we thought it would be wonderful. Douglas could learn things like cleaning windows and gardening and earn some pocket money. Douglas was 10 years of age at the time, and we now understand it was all part of the grooming process, because only many, many years later did we find out that he would get Douglas to swim naked in the swimming pool while he took lots of photographs. For the record, this offender's sexual orientation was as a covert gay man. For the next 7 years, this man would take our son out on a boat on the weekends, up the coast and to Rottnest Island, because Douglas loved diving, fishing and boating. We thought Douglas was having wonderful experiences, but we later discovered, much, much later, he was being sexually abused. Douglas died 1 week after his 25th birthday in 1994. And the only reason we came to know Douglas had been abused was because the Child Sexual Abuse Squad came to see us in September 2011 and told us. This was 18 years after Douglas completed suicide. They said they had interviewed a man in an interstate prison who told them his story of what had happened to him in his childhood. He was actually in prison because, sadly, he, the survivor of child sexual abuse, had gone on to become an offender. While he was in prison, he wrote to the W.A. Police Commissioner and the policeman who took it on, who was later commended in court for his diligence, noticed he had mentioned another boy in his statement of evidence, a boy called Douglas. He said Douglas, the boy who lived next door, was also sexually abused. When the police came to our home and told us, I remember thinking, this cannot be true. This man had taught our son how to manicure gardens, mow lawns, and clean windows in Claremont, Nedlands, Dalkeith, and Cottesloe. Also, I was a nurse, So I couldn't understand how under my watch as a mother, this could have happened to him. Douglas suffered profound emotional and psychological trauma, yet he courageously tried to live a normal life with us. He had also developed severe rheumatoid arthritis as a psychosomatic response to the ongoing sexual abuse. So in May 2013, there was a trial of the offender for 3 other survivors who were willing to be witnesses. There were other survivors, however, they were unwilling to be witnesses. I was a witness at the trial. The offender was sentenced to 8 years from a possible 10, which on appeal was reduced to 6 years. The offender served 3 years and was released on parole in April 2016. I have provided ongoing support to the disclosing victim in prison, who sadly had become an abuser himself, not once, but twice. He had actually taken himself to a psychiatric unit, asking for help, but he didn't get it, largely because I'm almost certain during the mental health history taking process, he was not asked if he had been sexually abused as a child, and so shortly after his discharge, he reoffended. But through this man's disclosure about his own abuse and the resulting arrest by police, we have learnt what happened to Douglas. The offender had made threats to the 13-year-old boy, and so we presume he did the same to Douglas, which is why we now believe Douglas never said anything to anybody. I still struggle with a number of factors: the profound deception, secrecy, betrayal of trust as a reality. Also, the inability to engage in reparative mediation with the offender because of the specified timeframes for this to be able to occur, and also because he maintained his plea of not guilty even as he was being sentenced. These were not helpful. The offender has never verbally expressed remorse or apologised to us for what he engaged in with Douglas. Also, his apparent lack of insight and understanding of how his child sexual abuse behaviours had impacted on Douglas as a young, vulnerable 10-year-old child. It is still so incredibly difficult for me to actually fully and completely comprehend this actually happened. We grieve the loss of Douglas and honour his life. The third part of my presentation is my clinical professional narrative. Unaware, I was a wounded healer. After many decades as a midwife and child health nurse, from the 1970s onwards, in 1992 I began providing clinical counselling services, still unaware of my own child sexual abuse. I went into private practice in 1998 as I was completing my Masters in Health Counselling. I still recall the very first client who disclosed to me the child sexual abuse, combined with severe physical, emotional, and psychological violence she had experienced from 12 years of age from her stepfather. I was the first person she had ever fully disclosed her story to. I will call my client Kath, not her real name. Kath would catch 2 buses to see me. I picked her up from the bus stop because I was living in an outlying rural area at the time. Kath had limited funds and so paid a nominal fee, and she also changed both her birth name and surname. I worked with Kath weekly for extended time sessions for 9 months until she made the decision to relocate interstate because the offender was due for release from prison and she feared for her life if she stayed in W.A. because she felt certain he would find her. When I became aware Kath was relocating, I asked her what had made the difference for her. Firstly, she said, "You believed me. Secondly, you did not judge or blame me. And thirdly, I felt you really cared for me." For many of us here today, we understand these as being critical core components of a truly therapeutic relationship. So for the past 19 years, I've continued to be the first person both men and women have disclosed their childhood sexual abuse to. I always feel profoundly privileged, however also deeply saddened at times to hear my clients' child sexual abuse stories. I work with clients utilising the ASCA practice guidelines for the treatment of complex trauma and the trauma-informed model of care and service delivery, published in Australia in 2012. I engage in both regular clinical supervision and personal counselling sessions. I have a belief in birth being an original blessing, not an original sin. And so when something happens to compromise or shape an individual's early life negatively, and then their behaviour is deemed to perhaps be sexually abusive, they need a level of compassion, understanding, and appropriate treatment, just as we currently provide for domestic violence, drug, and alcohol abusers. So for this reason, I have been able to provide emotional, psychological, and educative support since January 2012 to the survivor in the interstate prison. I have also provided this same level of support to his mother. From a professional clinical counselling perspective, I and others believe it is critical trauma experienced, particularly in childhood, for whatever reason, is recognised and identified as such. Appropriate support and counselling is offered and made available to enable healing to occur. So in adult, those who become parents have a maximum facilitative capacity to provide love, physical touch, care, attention, and nurturance to children. Professionals who are involved with educating parents, for example, midwives, child health nurses, counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists, and others, play a critical role in assisting with providing support, understanding, and educating parents on these important needs of children. How can we prevent abuse? By inoculating our children through an infusion of care, love, and supervision. Boys and girls neglected of love, physical touch, care, and attention are at greater risk of attracting the attention of potential abusers who will try to manipulate or seduce them for their own benefit. So we need to remember it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. So in conclusion, from a personal perspective, I'm on the cusp of entering my 7th decade, and even after 23 years and 2 weeks to the day, there are still no words that can adequately describe the almost daily emotional pain, sadness, yearning, and chronic mourning I experience because of the physical absence of Douglas in my life and the circumstances related to this. However, I feel very blessed indeed. I was able to become a resilient, strong survivor of my own child sexual abuse and to find meaning in my life, particularly in my professional work with parents and children after Douglas made the decision to depart this early life. This professional work continues to be an important part of my personal ongoing therapy, as the opportunity to be a presenter today has also been therapeutic. So in closing, I ask myself the question from a part of the invitation by Araya Mountain Dreamer, a Native American elder, and I quote, "I want to know if you have touched the centre of your own sorrow, if you have been opened by its betrayals, or have become shrivelled and closed for fear of further pain. My answer lies in a part of Please Call Me by My True Names by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I quote, "The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that are alive. Please call me by my true names so that I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so that I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names so that I can wake up, so that the door of my heart can be left open." Thank you.